ask you, it's sort of a leading question regarding what we were just talking about.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask you about poetic lineage.
Mm-hmm.
Since you sort of mentioned, now maybe not aunt and uncle, but the sort of grandfather and grandmother, Walt and Milly.
Right.
And Bishop, who for me seems like very much in that same sort of lineage.
Mm-hmm.
And, perhaps historians in years to come will see other lineages in terms of work that's happening now as being preempted. And I think that happens explicitly in poetry as opposed to the essay writing or fiction writing.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you have ever thought about that, or if you have, what you think about it, and if you haven't. Does that make sense? Yeah,
no, it makes sense. And what's interesting is sometimes it feels confusing to me, because as a poet, I sort of have my loves, and then as somebody who also is a teacher, there's that whole question of lineage. And I think one of the things that is interesting to me is, and I hope, if I move away from the question too much, you'll reel me back in. I think the thing that I'm thinking about now that interests me is that if you talk about the lyric poem as this thing that's supposed to be universal, right? That the point, that some people will say, well, as a reader, if I can step into the shoes of the speaker and speak this poem, there are going to be certain feelings and sentiments and something of the intellect that allows me to inhabit that moment. And the wonderful thing is that somebody can have written this sonnet in the 18th century, and I can read it today and I can still feel those things. And there's this linkage, right? There's this sort of common humanity that's shared. And then so much that's going on in terms of the in the zeitgeist of contemporary poetics, right, is this idea of identity, right? And when I say that we have this lineage of like Walt and Emily being the grandma and grandpa, or the mother and father, aunt and uncle of American poetry, a lot of people are like, well, they don't look anything like me. That's not my grandmother, that's not my grandfather. So I'm fascinated by this sort of butting of heads of this idea of the poem being something that is both. The lyric poem being something that's universal, and yet that's also specific to particular people in particular times, particular places. And so that whole lineage thing becomes interesting and quirky as a teacher, because then you have to think, well, if I'm teaching an African American kid from the Bronx, right, or a Latino or Latina kid, what's their heritage? Where's their language coming from? Who are the poets who are, what's their poetic heritage? Being an American, we have this sort of, being from white America, Emily and Walt come up, and I think that, they feel like a lineage to me, but that's not necessarily going to be the lineage, or it's an inherited lineage for somebody else, or an imposed one. But so I don't know if I'm making much sense, but I think there's this interesting sort of dilemma, both, as a conscious citizen in this time and this place in the United States, and also sort of the separate sort of poetry culture right now, where you have all the hubbub over AWP of late, and all the stuff with Vanessa Place, right, and Kenny Goldsmith, and all the sort of this interesting sense of like avant-garde poetry, which for a long time, I guess with those, like, about those two sort of controversies that are going on with those two folks lately. And I think that, avant-garde poetics, so since I've been sort of, I'm 48, and maybe, so I started reading Frank O'Hara and some of the avant-garde poets when I was maybe in my 20s. And I never really thought of, the avant-garde is really, really white, and that's being pointed out now, finally. It's sort of like, wow, what took us so long to realize this? Like, I needed somebody to hit me over the head and tell me this, but I didn't really think about it that much. And now it's something that's very much in the poetic community's mind, I think, and it's sort of much more visible. Or something like Vita, which is sort of, doing great work in terms of making sure that there's, more proportionate sort of publishing going on among, with gender. And then all the sort of explosion of what's going on with gender and all the different ways in which people are sort of coming to an identity of who they are and who they want to be in the world. I think that changes your lineages, right? So I often feel like I have to think about this question both as a teacher, and those lineages are constantly changing, and yet as an individual and what's germane to my own experience as a student, and the poets that I fell in love with, like Bishop and Dickinson, were, two that spoke to me for whatever particular reason, aside from all the stuff that's going on that we're getting externally from however we're being educated or whatever circles we're sort of studying and learning in.
What do you think about what's going on in the contemporary poetry world, or worlds, or like what is contemporary poetry?
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh God.
Is
That's
that like
too huge to tackle.
Well, whatever sort of corner you can bite off.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean.
feel comfortable talking
Yeah.
about.
I think. It's interesting because I was thinking I went to see a friend read at Burroughs Poetry Shop in Brooklyn, which is this all poetry bookstore that we have here, which is great. And as I get older and I go to more readings and I show up and everybody in the crowd looks like they're in their 20s and is kind of young and a hipster and whatnot, it's sort of, I feel older. And so I don't know if I necessarily have my finger on the zeitgeist, but I think that, I think Ashbery is a huge influence on a lot of the poetries that seem to be sort of in vogue right now. I don't think narrative has ever gone out, of style, but I do think that there are a lot of leaps in terms of focus and concentration within poems that sometimes I think both on one hand excite me and sort of charge the work, and on the other hand I think sort of makes a linearity within the poem sort of somewhat trickier for me. I think that and then I feel uncomfortable even saying that because I think that again there's such a variety of things that are going on. I mean, you still have people who are writing in sort of like Marie Niedecker's sort of really sort of jeweled, small, precise style, and then you still have people like Juan Felipe Pereira, who's our poet laureate, who's writing these wonderfully expansive, almost Whitman-esque kind of poems, and has been writing that way for years. Again, I think that the interesting thing for me is that the population is more varied and more diverse, and I feel like that's as it should be. So it's hard to sort of say for me, like, what is contemporary poetry feels like, what is the entire country? What is the world? I mean, and that's I guess that's as it should be. It's not a great answer to the question, but I do think, again, for me anyway, coming at it, and this is more coming at it from a teaching perspective than as a writer, but I mean even in the writing too, thinking about this sense of what has always, what I would call universal, is probably not, there's some universality to certain things, being isolated, loving, losing, etc. But challenging those perceptions of what is universal, that feels something that's germane to any kind of zeitgeist in any contemporary moment, is challenging that sense of what's been known, and then trying to sort of make it new, as it were. And then sort of Facebook sort of complicates things, because then you have all these little flare-ups and arguments and debates that go on, that pop up, and that's one way of keeping in touch with what's going on in different pockets of contemporary poetry. There was recently this controversy where I don't even remember the sort of the exact specifics of it, but basically the editor of a poetry journal called Rattle was sort of called out, and actually it was by one of my former high school students, who's now become an excellent poet in his own right, this guy Joey DeJesus. And Joey basically sort of wrote this Facebook post challenging the editor of Rattle, basically saying, your journal is pretty white. And then it turned into the editor sort of said something to Joey about not taking one of his poems because it was overwrought, and then it became this whole sort of personal thing, and people came to Joey's defense, and the editor was apologetic. But the larger, more important issue was Joey sort of addressing this idea of, if you are claiming that you have, blind submissions, you're basically accepting excellence when you publish a poem in your journal. It's becoming more and more apparent that one's standards for what excellence is might be affected by things like class and race, and I don't think that, I think there's enough sort of foment now where people are thinking about these things, which I think is great. And I think even Rattle has come out and sort of changed their, is I think addressing how they accept things, right? Thinking about, are you really sort of representing a poetic community, a very individualized and specific poetic community, or you sort of want everything that's out there? Where are you accepting things from? Are you publishing writers of color? Are you publishing more women? Things like that, I think, are necessary things that feels sort of zeitgeisty and important and essential, and that seems to be hopefully turning in a good direction. Even the fact that you have this weird cottage industry that we have in creative writing with AWP, a lot of people are challenging AWP. Like, are you having enough? Am I going to a panel and am I only seeing white people and white men, up there in front of people presenting? How are the numbers? Are they fair? And I think it's efficacious to sort of ask those things and ask those questions. And it's even weird to have like this weird kind of governing body within a creative discipline, right? It's sort of this weird mix of capital and literature that sort of comes together where you need a governing body and you have to go to a conference, and I don't know, it's strange.
It feels particularly zeitgeisty that there's this capitalist element, and then of course it's the avant-garde poetry that kind of blows things out of the the controversy around what's happening in certain aspects of avant-garde or conceptual poetry.
Right.
That would be where sort of the first explosion happens. Sort of all for explosion.
Yeah. And what's interesting though is that I know, for example, like poets like Juliana Spar and Joshua Clover who I admire very much. I admire their intellect, I admire their work. Joshua's somebody who I studied with, and it's been really fun to sort of see what he's done to sort of bring this idea of politics and economics and poetry to the forefront, or at least in the poetic community. That's what he wants to focus on. Those things are essential. And yet I write nothing like Joshua's work or Juliana's work. And yet I feel like it's essential that we have it. And for me, I think in some ways I have a much more conservative sense of what the lyric is for me. It's more of, it's affected by things like capital and politics and economy and where I live and the amount of money I make as a teacher and where I have to live, to make a living in New York. All those things affect my life, but for some weird reason, and it might be because I'm white and I'm a male and I've pretty much had a privileged upbringing and still have a privileged status in society, that those things, it's been harder for me to think about those things and bring them into the emotional space that goes into writing a poem. And I think that they're things I'm thinking about more in my work as I move from, having put out this first book and been traveling this last spring reading from it. It's a little disarming to not have a project, since I've had a project for so long. But it's interesting to see sort of how some of these things might begin to creep into the work and how the work might change. I don't know if it will change, but at least I'm conscious of these things as I'm sitting down.